To be charitable for a second, working with people you disagree with can be a pragmatic way to get things done. Coalitions are not inherently evil. Alexandre. We can't afford to fall into the same habits as trans-exclusionary feminists and betray all our principles over petty bullshit. There's a long future for the trans, queer, men, and women community no matter how things go this decade. That means we need to be measured in our approach. And we need to work to understand the opposition in all its complexity. Alexandre.
The Feminist to Far-Right Pipeline, a review as it pertains to men and masculinity. Among the biggest fish in the sea on this right now is bridging the gap between the feminists and those concerned with masculine issues. In the spirit of the opening quotes, I'm recommending folks consider watching this video also watch the video I am reviewing, and folks that have watched that video also watch this one, as it highlights the connectivity between things folks concerned with masculinity issues are saying, and things folks in feminist spaces are saying. Though there are differences and limitations to it, such as a proper mode of bridge building, or fishing in the deep blue seas. Here I'm going to try responding to what I think are the most pertinent points made as they relate to the issues of masculinity and femininity from a gendered and leftist perspective. Most of what is said is really only responding to the first 42 minutes or so, but the whole video was reviewed to make this one. There is a reticence on the part of Alexandre to acknowledge that there is something inherent to feminism, femininity, or women more broadly construed, that actually excludes folks as a matter of course in order to define themselves. For instance, she says that it was
bigots that moved into feminist spaces, not the other way around. Alexandre.
And Alexandre says,
the exclusion is the feminism, even when the exclusion is other women.
As if this were an oddity rather than as a norm for the practice of feminism, femininity, or women more broadly construed. The exclusion of men is a defining feature of feminist theory, which TBH, we might even hold as potentially okay, though such does run into obvious potential problems, e.g. breeding ground for misandry and deep divisions between the sexes. I think Alexandre is either ignoring or unaware of the reality that non-whites, queers, and non-Westerners, not to mention men, have had to fight to even be accepted within feminist spaces, let alone anything akin to having a seat at the table. The exclusion of trans women because they are men is a feature, not a bug within feminism. Regarding claims made by TERFs and gender criticals,
excluded minorities don't really want to be included. They only want to be included so they can brutalize innocent women.
Alexandre is correct in pointing out the horrors that this attitude implies, but is seemingly not entirely aware of how that actually applies to many claims within feminism itself and its praxis, e.g. the irrational fears of men more broadly construed. I also think it prudent to point out that Alexandre is not wrong, and is not attacking men either, and what she is saying dovetails well with men's issues and concerns regarding mistreatment of masculinity in general. She being a trans woman, a queer, giving her a similar kind of perspective as men more generally have within women's spaces. For instance, Alexandre rightly points out how that kind of rhetoric is historically and commonly used to target black men as being inherently more violent, especially sexually violent, towards especially white women. She also quotes another feminist who points out the history of fraudulent rape charges leveled in particular against black men, how rape laws and fraudulent rape charges were used to protect the upper class, whites in particular. That such might be more broadly applicable is not mentioned by Alexandre, and I worry that such is simply being overlooked by her and feminists more broadly. Of fascists and far-righters, Alexandre says,
they conceive of themselves as pro-woman, even feminist, by way of wanting nothing to do with certain people.
True, though it isn't just any people, it is certain groups of men. It is the targeting of men in particular that is the modus operandi of the feminist, fascist, and far-righters alike. Hence the relative ease with which these sorts of folks intermingle. Note this isn't something that is a travesty if they conceive of themselves as feminists, which is what Alexandre is tacitly implying. It is part and parcel of what it means to be feminist. Though I would strongly temper that by saying not all feminists, and not all feminist theories for that matter. The point is that it is a distinctly woman-like problem, the blaming and castigating of men as a means of in-grouping themselves as women, which also manifests itself within feminism. It is, to be blunt, a distinct problem within feminism, both in its theories and in its praxis. Alexandre makes a similar, not wrong, argument regarding how trans people are treated.
When trans people do something bad, it is because they are trans.
The bads and the bads are sexual in nature. This is but a specific instance of the generalizable reality as it relates to men in particular. Now, while I definitely hold to the position that trans women are women, the point here would be that those leveling those kinds of charges hold trans women to account specifically because they consider them as men or masculine in some way. Their predatoriness is about their proximity to masculinity, which just highlights the irrational fear, paranoia really, that is in place surrounding women and their sexuality. An irrational fear that is stemming primarily from women themselves. Alexandre says,
regarding coverage of crimes that are deliberately associated as being caused by a person's transness, coverage like this works to turn implicit bias to explicit hatred. As the reader's association between trans people and violence grows, gender conformity becomes synonymous with safety, and must therefore be enforced by every institution.
Same but with men. Men are violent, men are predators, all men are trash, and so on. Witness the horrors of safety cultures whereby men are targeted for being men and for their expressions of masculinity, and again recall that trans people are being targeted predicated upon their proximity to masculinity. Insofar as they pass as women, there is no targeting of them. I don't mean to usurp the harms and targeting of trans people. I mean to point out that the targeting of gender insofar as it is occurring primarily against men by women. The who of the targeting is itself very gendered. Men are targeted, they are targeted primarily by women, and those who are primarily tasked with enforcing it are other men. At this point, Alexandre makes a more explicit point that concerns about male violence against women is used as a means to make the case for race realism by no less than neo-Nazi Richard Spencer. The targeting of outgroup males, those bad ones over there, made at the behest of women broadly construed, to be carried out by in-group males, the good ones over here, predicated upon race. Though she almost immediately backs off from confronting the reality by reasserting that
sexual violence is a real problem that women are facing.
Again, that is the underpinning claim being used to justify all the false allegations being made. The claim that there is a rampant problem with sexual violence, or that sexual violence against women is a real and serious kind of problem we all have to face up to right now, are the exact kinds of rhetoric that is underpinning the problem. It isn't that sexual violence doesn't happen. It isn't even that sexual violence doesn't happen to women. It isn't even that sexual violence does happen to men by women, which it does with a frightful frequency BTW. It is that the level of fear people invoke around that topic is exactly the real problem. People have always, cared about sexual violence. It has rarely been a dismissible sort of thing. It is a central feature of the species' modes of fear-mongering rather explicitly towards racist, bigoted, sexist, classist, cultural chauvinistic, and tribalistic ends. One of the big lies in feminism and within the broader discourses is the pretense that people don't care about sexual violence. People might selectively care about it. They might use it to target this or that group, but they definitely care about it. A lot. A whole lot of care is given to it. Far too much care is given to it, especially as it concerns women. And the marshalling of the forces of hatred utilized that fact as a means of divisiveness and control. All done on the backs of and at the expense of men. Men be but toy soldiers and disposable heroes in such fights. Regarding fascists, Alexandre says,
the aim is to create as many enemies as possible.
What she doesn't say or even really hint at is that the fascists are saying to create as many men as enemies as is possible. It is not women that are being targeted as enemies, it is men, masculinity, and how that might be expressed in this or that manner, typically maybe even largely as a matter of how those men treat women. The justification and modus operandi is, again, about how to target men predicated upon their treatment of women. I'd note that such dovetails well with classic feminist criticisms that these fights occur surrounding the bodies and sexualities of women. What is being strongly questioned here is who is doing what and why, not necessarily the facts of the sexual bodies about which it is occurring. Regarding current broad cultural dispositions, Alexandre says,
Everyone is united behind the line that the political establishment has unfairly sided with minorities.
I think this displays both a truth and a deep ignorance of the problems. There is a significant push back against certain claims, theories, and positions, but it isn't all reducible to an unfair siding with minorities. Questions such as who is a minority, who are generally being targeted, who is generally doing the targeting, and what does it really even mean to be a minority? These are what is being called into question, broadly speaking. How folks are responding to that may say something about them and the gender dynamics in play, but here the point is that it can't be reduced to concerns of unfairness being given to minorities. There are deeper criticisms being leveled about the theories of justice that are in play and use. And as this piece is increasingly showing, Alexandre and many folks left, right, and center don't seem to grasp well at the actual dynamic that is in play, the interplay between women, men, and queer people, whereby men are generally the targets. Even as they point out specific current and historical instances of this exact thing happening, even as they relate it well to the real problems, they're still apparently too blind to grasp at the generalizable form of the problem, the targeting of men for the outrages of how they treat their women folk. People are primed to view women as the victims, men as the perps. Regarding the anti-trans folk, Alexandre says,
Living in an anti-trans bubble.
Anti-man bubble.
Understanding transness.
Understanding masculinity.
As a social plague. Hearing about every sin or transgression committed by a trans person.
Committed by a man.
I have to imagine that you're living in a different reality from everyone else.
Indeed, such is the feminine malady. Irrational fears predicated upon real violence, whereby that real violence just doesn't match up to the reality of the fears so crafted. This kind of irrational fear is a primary factor in what is going on, broadly speaking, and it is also a primary factor of concern regarding men's issues and masculinity. In regards to folks radicalizing against trans folks, Alexandre says,
As you radicalize further, the gap between your reality and everyone else's grows. And as that gap grows, so must the size of the cover-up.
Practically definitional of the claims of a patriarchy. The overarching massive conspiracy that all men partake in it in order to oppress women. This is but the expected kind of output from the specific inputs already alluded to in this piece. Women's irrational fears of men used to target outgroup men with the tool of in-group men towards the aims of assuaging the irrational fears of women that they themselves create regarding their sexuality and how they want to be treated by men. The most plausible explanation of a mind driven by such irrational fears is exactly something like a supposition of a patriarchy or any other sort of broad overarching intangible entity that is controlling everything, conspiracy gone wild. Link in the description. Either as a real thing or as an imagined, abstracted structure. The former having maximal craziness to it, the latter merely wildly overstating men's roles in what is undoubtedly actually a heteronormative complex with a significant queer component. Conclusion. The video is speaking of particular instances of a generalizable kind of phenomenon, the use of puritanical dispositions about sex and sexuality as means of manipulation and control of the lower classes, the outgroup people. Especially as it relates to men and how men treat their women folk. We might even surmise that these are at least correlated with each other, as in, if there is an increasing emphasis being placed on sexual morality, which manifests itself by way of increasing legal operati to enforce sexual mores, we might also expect there to be an increasing push against the lower classes, the outgrouped people. In sum, Puritanism criminalizes sexual behavior as a means of control. Suggestion. Folks ought consider the Puritanism claim as a legit line of argumentation against folks using sexual mores as a means to persecute men broadly, and queers in particular. These are the same kind of phenomena. That kind of tactic may be useful for convincing lefties of the problems, and may also be something that the righties would have sympathies with too. I don't think Alexandre is attacking men in her analysis, and indeed, I think the video is potentially useful to folks for hearing a feminist speaking about issues that at least have some translatability to men's issues in a non-asinine way. Likewise, despite the criticisms, the Battleground ATM is about the queers, including the trans, even if we are speaking of men's issues. Not to conflate the two, but to hold to the point that the right and the left are attacking the queers primarily ATM. That they are doing so in no small part along the grounds of masculinity is important, and may even be useful for coalition building and realizing the generalized faults within the feminist theories and praxis, how those relate to fascistic thinking and praxis, but nonetheless the practical battlefield remains the queers. That battle just also plays out on the backs of men and masculinity, howsoever it is that folks construe that. To quote the poets, old-timer, who you gonna kill next? Still fucking insane with the bravery of being out of range.
What a man.